All right, guys. Thanks for joining us again for our last post-game show of the 2021-2022 season. And for Notre Dame fans, at least, and this is the Notre Dame post-game show at the Voice of College Football. Certainly not the way they wanted to end things with, sort of the hype around the program right now with Kelly leaving for LSU, Marcus Freeman getting the promotion. And I think everybody felt that a win today was certainly going to be like this feel good story, kind of to end the season with everything going on. And unfortunately, Notre Dame got off to a really hot start, 14-0 lead that led to a 28-7 lead with about 2 or so minutes left in the game, or left in the half, I should say. And then Oklahoma State scores to end the half. Notre Dame elects to go into the half with their 14-point lead. And then from there on out, it was essentially all Oklahoma State. Notre Dame ended up with one touchdown and only 7 points total in the second half. And Oklahoma State made the proper adjustments and really dominated. But I'm joined by my co-host for the Voice of College Football, Ben Belden, to break this down for you guys. We'll touch on some off-season stuff, I'm sure, and I'm sure we'll get some comments on Notre Dame's bowl history as well. But how are you doing, Ben?
Reasonably, I'm okay. I mean, obviously rather disappointed. Also, just I'll put a disclaimer out there, battling the upper respiratory stuff that's been going around, especially the Midwest, the last couple of weeks. So playing hurt a little bit, but I'll try to not cough on the mic a little bit and make this any worse than it has to be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, no, I mean, it's certainly it's hard to put into words sort of what kind of went down, and it's frustrating to say the least. I know me and you are obviously both Notre Dame fans first, and that makes it probably a little bit more difficult to talk about. And then second, we're analysts. So yeah, no, I mean, it's frustrating, and you're going to get the trolls and stuff out there that say Notre Dame can't win the big game and so on and so forth. And I think that that's certainly something that we have to deal with today. All Notre Dame fans, I think, have to deal with that today. And, I think most fans of teams that are in our same position, which is, a lot of programs. I mean, you look around and a lot of programs are, have bad records in bowl games, have bad records in New Year's Six and playoff games and stuff like that. But Notre Dame not winning one of these New Year's Six bowl games or better since essentially the time I was born. I think the last time they won one was in 1994. I was born in 93. And so I technically haven't really seen one. And I know you're pretty much in the same boat there, Ben, but you also try to put things into perspective. I mean, I think in today's college football world, I don't want to call these games meaningless. They're certainly not meaningless when I'm watching it. I was, it was one of the most intense games I've watched over the last couple of years for Notre Dame. I was on the edge of my seat for a lot of it, even when they were up by 21 points. And, it certainly felt like sort of like a changing of the tide at one point, where Notre Dame hasn't, like I mentioned, has not won one of these games in 20 plus years, and it felt like they could kind of get over that schneid, whether that means anything or not. I mean, next year, every year's different. The team's going to be completely different next year. I mean, new quarterback, new players at multiple positions, and so on and so forth. So in reality, it really is just this team. But for the fans, and I think even for the players to an extent, that monkey off their back isn't happening, and we'll see what it leads to with a new coach and new era of Notre Dame football.
Yeah, and to that point, as I was getting ready to log on here and thinking about the things that I was going to talk about and what we were going to talk about, obviously I knew that this was going to be a major point, a major talking point of Notre Dame being unable to get the monkey off their back. And I was sort of had this thought, and I just kind of want to get your thoughts on this a little bit, Nathan, that, I know that there has been some good positive momentum for Notre Dame, at least reasonably after Brian Kelly left. I mean, the promotion of Marcus Freeman and everything recruiting wise and things that has happened recently that kind of kept the momentum going, that made this feel like something that could have been real bad turned into something that was real good, I guess. And so, I was kind of, and I know that people were sort of thinking, oh, yeah, this is great. There's a new vibe, new Notre Dame, new this and that. And Marcus Freeman's at the head now, and we're going to get this monkey off our back and this and that. And I got to be honest, I don't know that this particular game, like I say, I know it puts a damper on some of that positive momentum that fans and things were feeling. However, I don't think it really changes a whole lot. I mean, when you think about the things that Notre Dame struggled with today, I mean, there's a lot of places to cast blame. I get that. I don't know that Marcus Freeman's really one that's it's real fair to start casting blame on him particularly, just because, the offense sputtered so badly in the second half. But if you really think about it, for a month ago, not even a month ago, how much did Marcus Freeman have to do with Notre Dame's offense? How much knowledge does he have of what Notre Dame is doing offensively? I mean, not a ton, right? So, this might be a hot take way of saying this, but Notre Dame maybe missed having their regular head coach, regardless of who it was. I mean, Brian Kelly, because, how much help was Marcus Freeman today as the new head coach when it comes to like suggesting, hey, why don't we take a look at this on offense? I mean, does that make sense? Is what I'm saying making sense? I mean, because I just sort of think to myself, if this is Marcus Freeman's team and he's, like I say, he's still relatively new to having anything to do with the offensive side of the ball at Notre Dame at the very least. So, I don't know. Like, this is not a full Marcus Freeman team. And I know you were kind of alluding to that, kind of in your opening comments that, the team's going to be way different next year. So, next year in this type of a situation, maybe Marcus Freeman has more of a better answer as to, what to say to Tommy Rees. Like, hey, like, let's take a look at this look or whatever the situation is. I have a feeling that, this was a situation where certainly Marcus Freeman was going to, lean on his offensive coordinator, Tommy Rees, and, his acting defensive coordinator, Mike Elston, because it's a new thing for him. I just sort of think that after spring and an off season and all of that type of stuff, Marcus Freeman's a good football coach and he's going to have more to do with that type of stuff. And we wouldn't have been as likely to see that had Notre Dame, that being what happened today, had Notre Dame had the same guy that had been their head coach the whole time.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Kind of going off of that, one of the things that I've mentioned over the last, few weeks on my podcast and in my spaces and stuff that I do with my co-host Mason Plummer on a weekly basis is that this Notre Dame team, even though Marcus Freeman in the new era has sort of taken over and overwhelmed the fan base, I guess for lack of a better word, this was still a Brian Kelly team to an extent. And it felt like this was sort of the end of that. Now, and you bring up a good point. I mean, obviously with Brian Kelly gone and not on the sideline for Notre Dame, maybe things are different. Maybe they also don't get off to a 28-7 lead because that was pretty rare for Brian Kelly in these types of games as well. But it is interesting. Obviously, you see Buckner getting no snaps. I honestly was of the opinion that with no Brian Kelly, maybe Buckner would receive more snaps. And then obviously the other kind of, I think, idea behind this is, does Notre Dame allow 37 points if Marcus Freeman is your defensive coordinator calling all of the plays and different things like that? You have to, I don't want to say that this was a job interview for Mike Elston, but there had been some rumors over the last, week or so that, he might have been a little bit more in the running for the defensive coordinator position than at least originally thought. And after today, I think that you could probably throw that out the window, at least in my opinion. I think he is someone that's going to stay at Notre Dame and be a really good defensive line coach and a really good recruiter per usual. But I think you probably got to bring in someone at defensive coordinator that Freeman trusts to call plays. Maybe that's Mike Tressel at Cincinnati, who he's familiar with. Not necessarily coaching wise. I don't think Tressel was actually there when Freeman was there, or at least not for very long. Coming over from Michigan State, but he has a lot of, he's had a lot of success with someone like his uncle, Jim Tressel at Ohio State, and I know they know each other very well. maybe it means promoting someone like a Mike Mickens or bringing in someone from the Cincinnati staff that he knows. I know there's been some rumors of that as well. So a lot of things to digest. And, one of the things that I'll continue to kind of preach is that while this was a disappointing loss and certainly a damper on things and certainly no excuse overall, but I just don't think this is going to have, and it kind of alluding to your point, I don't think it's going to have much effect on the team moving forward. I still think that they're very excited about just this new era of Notre Dame football, for better or for worse. I mean, it still remains to be seen how Freeman will be as a head coach, but I don't think that this is really going to put much of a damper on it.
Yeah. I just don't think today's, obviously, like I say, it's a disappointment, as a lot of people are saying in the chat, that it's a disappointment to see how it went down. But at the very end of it all, like I say, I think this is the closing of the book of the Brian Kelly era, as more so than his actual leaving. And now Marcus Freeman gets to go put his stamp on everything. I don't think we've seen Marcus Freeman put his stamp. I mean, I know he's a defensive guy. I know he's a defensive coach, played defense. He's got some ideas about what to do on offense that I imagine were not really a whole ton of the game plan in this particular game. So, now's the closing of the Brian Kelly era, in my opinion. I know he wasn't there today, and I know he's moved on and all of that, but now it's, the evaluation of Marcus Freeman starts now, I feel like, as opposed to when it started, when he completely took over, I guess. So, I don't know. Like, it's hard to really put into words how I really feel about it. But I just, like I say, now is where the changing happens, as opposed to whatever happened, whatever changing of the guard happened, in my honest opinion.
Yeah. And then, so kind of walking through the game real quick, and then maybe we'll get to some big picture stuff, depending on maybe some of the comments and stuff. I know they're starting to roll in a little bit here. Obviously, like I mentioned, if you guys are just joining us, Notre Dame was up 14-0, pretty much on the blend. I think their first drive scored, second drive went 3 and out, third drive scored. Defense was playing well to start the game. They were getting pressure. Secondary was playing well at the beginning, and Notre Dame was up 28-7 with just over a minute to play. And we've actually seen this story a few times this year for Notre Dame, where the defense is playing really well and then gives up a score, sort of towards the end of the half, and people get worried and so on and so forth. But at the same time, someone mentioned this where like they saw this from a mile away when when Oklahoma State scored to make it 28-14. And my response to them was, they were up 28-14. I know Oklahoma State was getting the ball, but they were still up 14 points, and your offense had shown no reason to think that they were only going to score 7 and essentially nothing until in the second half. And, frankly, they just really didn't make adjustments, I guess. I mentioned, obviously, no Buckner to kind of help the running game when, to start the second half specifically. Tommy Rees got a little bit more conservative and was trying to call more run plays. And, I don't know if that was necessarily the wrong approach. It seemed like some of the run plays actually picked up 5-6 yards at a time, but then on third down, Cohn would get sacked or, throw an incomplete pass and through the interception and so on and so forth. But, it really is hard to put into words what happened. At first I wanted to put more of the blame, on the defense, because you can't give up, 24 unanswered points or something close to that. And I know the offense sputtered, but like I mentioned, you're up 28-14. You probably should have made your field goal from Jonathan Dora to make it 31 points in the first half. But it's just, it's hard to classify really what went really wrong. But Clarence Lewis didn't have his best game in a Notre Dame uniform. I hate it for him, only because I think that he's going to get a lot of hate on social media, which is just really unfair to a college athlete. I don't think the Notre Dame coaching staff really really put him in position to succeed as well. Left him out on an island multiple times, and I understand you can't do that. Or you can't say, hey, we're going to give you help over the top every single play, because then you expose other parts of your defense as well. But at the same time, essentially the last play of the game for him, before, I think that was right before the Spencer Sanders field goal, or right. It was, I forgot if it was the last field goal attempt by Oklahoma State, or if it was right before the Spencer Sanders fumble where he got beat over the top again, and probably should have been called for pass interference as well, but it didn't happen. So, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what I would have done differently for Notre Dame. It just seemed like, kind of went off the hinges there, and they didn't really have an answer for it.
Well, I think for me, you've kind of said it a couple times, and I feel the same way, that, I don't know exactly where to narrow down and pinpoint like one thing that went wrong. But I guess what I will say is that, there was no complimentary football going on whatsoever in the entire second half. I mean, the defense comes out, they're on their, they take the field first. They're on their heels. They're on their entire second half. Obviously, Oklahoma State made adjustments. Obviously, the tempo of the Oklahoma State offense was clearly starting to weigh on Notre Dame's defense. I mean, that was very apparent. But the other part of that is the offense didn't do anything to help that situation either. The offense was barely able to stay on the field long enough to, at the very least, even flip field position, or at the very least run a drive where you pick up just 2 first downs and run 3 or 4 or 5 minutes of game clock. And that to me was just everything was going wrong. Everything from, not being able to run the ball. That was very, very frustrating, because, it felt like Notre Dame had made such great strides in the run game. And I know Kyron Williams not being there had probably a little bit to do with that. I mean, he maybe shakes a tackle here and there, gets a couple more yards, Notre Dame gets a couple more first downs. But like I say, I just think that anything that could go wrong, for Notre Dame did go wrong in the second half, in terms of just not being able to do this or not being able to do that, or not being able to protect Jack Cohen to the point where then he gets a little bit more happy-footed in the pocket, and it just wasn't good altogether. Like, there was no defense helping the offense helping the defense. There's no complimentary football going on absolutely whatsoever. And that was the part that I sort of thought was, I don't know, that was the most disappointing thing for me.
And it's funny, kind of going to your point where you say that the Notre Dame offense wasn't really even able to help the defense. The 2 drives in the second half that looked promising, you have a Logan Diggs fumble on a play that was very close to his progression, or his progression being stopped. And kind of an unfortunate fumble. It's hard to blame the kid for that one. And then, but again, it kind of just goes back to Notre Dame's bowl game history, or whatever you want to call it, to kind of like an oy vey sort of moment. But, and then obviously they're driving down the field, and Cohn throws that pick. And it was really outside of a few overthrows and stuff like that, it was really his biggest mistake of the game. And then Oklahoma State, toward the end of the game, essentially tried to let Notre Dame back into it, or at least give them a chance to do something. They fumbled the ball, like not even on the 1 yard line, like essentially, like at the last second. The way you can fumble it is kind of it kind of reminded me of the Sean Crawford fumble a few years back. I think it was against either Michigan or Michigan State. I can't remember exactly who it was, but it kind of felt like that, where it's like, oh, okay, this is the one thing Notre Dame needed to kind of it kind of felt like that. Okay, this is what Notre Dame, this is how they're going to win this game, is that their defense finally made like that one play, and then the offense will get it cooking, and then they go 3 and out, I think, on the very next offensive drive. And then Spencer Sanders fumbles. Yep. Notre Dame has a chance to go and do the same thing again. And I forget if it was a 3 and out on that one, or no, that was when they went for 4 downs. Yeah. Which actually brings to another point. The broadcast mentioned it. I'm sure some fans mentioned it as well. I personally liked the idea of them going for it on 4th and 7 there. I trusted the offense a little bit more to do something versus the defense that had just been cooked all second half. It turns out that maybe we were wrong with the way that the score ended up. Notre Dame's defense was able to kind of stop them those last couple drives and hold them to field goals and so on and so forth. And maybe they would have stopped them and forced a punt. But I think that that's one of those things where hindsight's always 2020, and you look back at it, and who knows what Notre Dame's defense would have done when, however, that punt would have ended up from Bramblett. And so, to me, that was one of those decisions where you're trying to be aggressive, you're trying to go out and show that your offense or give some faith to your offense and stuff. And yeah, it didn't really bother me as much. But how did you feel about that one?
Yeah, I mean, I really can see both because, I mean, if you punt there, I know it was 2.5 minutes or whatever the situation was and 3 timeouts, that's a for sure. But does Oklahoma State come out and run it 3 times automatically if you punt it right there? I mean, I think Oklahoma State was saying basically, all right, we're going to run it 3 times, go up by 2 scores, make Notre Dame use all 3 of their timeouts. And if we happen to pick up a first down, then great. If not, cool. We're still up 2 scores with Notre Dame having no timeouts left. And obviously that was a big thing there. So, I sort of see both sides there. Like I say, I think I probably go for it right there. I mean, you were hanging on by a thread at that point. So that's not the play, I guess, that I look back to as like, well, this Notre Dame lost because of this. I mean, and I don't think anyone's saying, but I don't know. It's really a stuck between a rock and a hard place type of a thing. And, I don't know. I don't really know what the right answer is, but like I say, that doesn't really bother me as much as, some of the other stuff coaching wise and decision making wise and not seeing Tyler Buckner and that type of stuff does.
I would have liked to see, and I know we mentioned this a few times now, one play really sticks out to me. And this is actually when Notre Dame was playing well, and they ended up, I think this is when they either missed the field or when Dorr missed the field goal, or they ended up having one of their drives in the first half that kind of sputtered. There was a 3rd and 2 where I think it was Diggs, kind of.
Yep.
And I tweeted right afterwards. It was he looked a little bit. I mean, one of the biggest strengths he has as a player is his patience. You heard it on the broadcast today. He's very Le'Veon Bell, Arian Foster like in the way that he runs. I'm not comparing him to those 2 guys because they were obviously very terrific, NFL players. But just his style of play is very like that. Maybe even Matt Forte like is kind of the guy I've compared him to in the past with his pass catching ability as well. And I think if he hits the hole there, he probably gets it. I think he only missed it by maybe a half a yard. But at the same time, if you put Buckner in on 3rd and 2, that's exactly where I wanted to see him this game. And I think it's exactly what me and you have been preaching almost this entire season is if Cohn's going to be your main guy, which is fine. I mean, look what he did today. He threw for nearly 500 yards, had 5 touchdowns. I mean, it's hard to blame put the game on him completely. I mean, there was definitely some moments in the second half where I think he was rattled a bit as a 5th-year senior, which you don't like. But there were some moments in today's game where I think Buckner would have provided not even just a spark, but just a different sort of look for the Oklahoma State defense. And I think that there's plays that you can point to where Notre Dame kind of did there because Cohn's not running the ball when they do any sort of RPO or whatever you want to call it. And there were definitely some plays where it looked like if Buckner kept the ball or Cohn kept the ball, there was yardage there and or just some other things that could have happened. And so yeah, they were not playing Buckner at least a couple snaps today was certainly flustering to me overall.
Yeah, and I don't know. I agree with that. At the same time, I'm not surprised though, because if you listen to Marcus Freeman, when as soon as he got the job as the head coach at Notre Dame, he started preaching about this isn't about the future. This is about this last game. This is about the guys, the seniors, the people who got us here in that type of situation. And so, I immediately, that sticks out to me just because when he said that, I immediately said, well, it'll be interesting to see if Tyler Buckner gets any snaps or not. I mean, I had that thought as soon as those words came out of Marcus Freeman's mouth. I mean, I was asked about it on another show where I was a guest this past week. Are we going to see Tyler Buchner? And I basically said, well, I don't know, because I think he's gonna ride or die with Jack Cohn because of of the things that he's given to this program, all the things that every coach has said. Tommy Rees coming out and saying, that we underestimated Jack Cohn, and the praise for Jack Cohn was really high coming into this game. Let's put it that way. And so, I sort of thought, maybe in a spot or two, you might see Tyler Buchner and maybe even like a trick play, because that type of stuff seems to manifest itself in bowl games a lot. So I sort of thought maybe you'd see something like that, some sort of gimmicky this or that, or put him on the field at the same time, or whatever the situation was, But so, yeah, I'm a little surprised that 0 snaps, but I never really thought Buchner was going to get even a full drive at this point. It was probably like, a lot of people said this on Twitter, it was probably too late to change the game plan and put him in for a full drive at some point in this game. But I don't know. When you started to see Oklahoma State's defense start dropping 7 or 8 guys pretty much all the time, and then still Notre Dame can't run the ball, then you got to think to yourself, well, you just got to do something different. Even if it's calling a run play, or a pass play with Buchner in there, knowing that he can turn that into 5 or 6 yards, then maybe that's what you got to do. But I don't know. Like I say, that's something we won't have to worry about next year. I mean, we're not going to, Tyler Buchner is going to be the guy. And if he's not, it's Drew Pine, I guess. And still you get a little bit more of the running quarterback and that type of stuff. So I don't know. Like I say, we're splitting hairs and getting down to, like you said, you nailed you hit the nail on the head when you said hindsight is 2020. I know Notre Dame's coaching staff is going to go back and look at this and be like, well, if we did this, then maybe that, and all of this situation. But I don't know. Like I say, the rambling I think that I'm doing right now is just very indicative of the frustration of just being right there. And, like I mentioned earlier, just being right there and thinking, we could have got a monkey off of our back, didn't. But at the same time, this was more about the beginning of a new era than it was anything else.
And I do think the monkey off the back situation is a little bit less prevalent in today's college football world, with opt-outs and stuff like that. I hate that excuse for losing a game, especially when you're up 28-7 with a little bit to go in the first half. But it's probably a different game if Kyron Williams and Kyle Hamilton are playing. Now, obviously, if Kyle Hamilton's playing, that means they're in a playoff game, because that was really the only opportunity he would have played. But it still would have been nice to see that for your secondary, because he's just so good in the secondary. It's incredibly fun to watch him play, and it was sad that we didn't get to see that over the last few weeks, and certainly in the bowl game as well. But I think what you brought this up. I think me and you are in a kind of an agreement here with the Buchner situation. Neither of us were expecting him to get full drives. And there was certainly a time in the second half that I would have liked to see it, just because it would have been something different. And maybe that's when that spark is provided. But I honestly thought, with essentially a month to prepare for this game, there was going to be a game plan for Buchner that didn't, like, this whole idea that, it's Cohn's team, he deserves to be the starter. He is the starter. Like, it was going to be him 90% of the time. But, like, leaving a weapon of Tyler Buchner, of his, leaving the weapon of Tyler Buchner, I guess, just not even in the game plan at all was kind of, flustering to me, flabbergasting, if you want to even go that far. And just because you've seen what he's done in other games this year, without full drives. I know, like, you look at Virginia Tech, he kind of brought Notre Dame back. That's more of that spark that maybe he could have provided in this second half. But there were just several times in the red zone this year, or in short yarded situations, or when Cohn is struggling, so you put Buchner in for a few plays just to kind of get it going. He had that really long run against Stanford when they were up, and it was like, okay, they were up against Stanford by a lot, and you knew that they weren't going to lose that game. You're up 28-7, 28-14 going into halftime against, Oklahoma State. And I know it's a bowl game and you want to win and you want to stick with what's working. And the passing attack was certainly working in the first half, but it doesn't mean you have to completely not go to a guy, like I mentioned, who is probably a top 5 or 6 weapon for you on offense this year, and especially without Kyron Williams playing in the game. So that's what was frustrating to me, is that you couldn't, that Tommy Rees, as much as I love him, and I'm a huge Tommy Rees guy. I think he's a terrific coach. He's going to be he's going to be a college football head coach here soon, I think. They were even reporting on the broadcast that he turned down the highest paid OC gig in the entire country to go be with Brian Kelly. So obviously I know Brian Kelly likes him. Maybe that doesn't do it for other people, but it does it for me enough to know that someone like that, who's getting big time jobs, thinks that highly of someone. So, but it was frustrating, to say the least, that Buckner couldn't get in the game plan somehow.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know, like you kind of mentioned it. You would sort of think that, it was all over Twitter today that when things were rolling well for Notre Dame offensively, it was, Brian Kelly had his guy Tommy Rees handcuffed to a certain degree. And maybe that's true. I really don't know that that's as true as some people make it. I actually tend to think Brian Kelly helped Tommy Rees in a lot more situations than Notre Dame fans realize, which is also why I think if Brian Kelly is the head coach for this particular game, Notre Dame, hold everything equal up to the point where Notre Dame gets up 28-7. If Brian Kelly's the coach at that point, which I don't know, like you mentioned, I don't know that Notre Dame gets up 28-7 with Brian Kelly as the coach. I don't know. But if Brian Kelly's the head coach at that point, I don't think Notre Dame loses this particular one, because I think he helps Tommy Rees along. When the offense starts sputtering, Brian Kelly's the guy that interjects and fixes it, I think. Now, Brian Kelly's not here. Tommy Rees has to learn. And like I say, I don't know. So where am I going with this? I don't know. I'm frustrated. But, to your point, I guess I just sort of thought that, like, as everybody is saying, Brian Kelly handcuffed Tommy Rees. Well, why then, if Tommy Rees is calling the shots, did he not go to Buckner? You know what I mean? You would think that if it was completely true that Brian Kelly had not, given Tommy Rees full reins, well, that would imply that Tommy Rees maybe would have been frustrated at some point by the fact that, I can't go to Tyler Buckner whenever I want to. I can't call this part of the playbook. Well, that's not the excuse today, So I don't know. It is interesting, like I say, at the very least, to see that Buckner didn't enter the game. But I don't know. I just think that at the end of all of this, these are not going to be questions, I guess, that we'll have next year. I mean, it's going to be Tyler Buckner, and we're going to ride or die, and we're going to do those types of things. And, I think Notre Dame will be better off for it. Doesn't help us today, but that's my silver lining, is that I think Notre Dame will be better off for it in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. I think me and you are kind of in agreement there. I mean, this future is certainly bright overall. Two things I wanted to bring up that I thought were interesting. And obviously, this goes back to Cone. I don't want to call Cone a statue, but he's certainly not a running quarterback by any means. And that's when they ended up struggling in the second half. When, have you ever seen, when's the last time you saw Cone make a play with his legs that didn't include picking up just a few yards on the ground? Like, for example, like when he gets pressured and he gets away and he's able to throw it away, that's great. You don't get a sack, but like I think it was the 4th and 7 play. He got pressured a little bit. He threw one up to Kevin Austin, which actually probably wasn't the worst throw ever. It was decent. And if the safety doesn't make a good play, it's probably a touchdown, to be completely honest, with the way he had the corner beat. But it just seems so much more often than not when a team is able to put any sort of pressure on him. And this is where Oklahoma State was able to make their adjustments. The quick passing game that was huge for Notre Dame in the first half simply was not there in the second half. So so Cone had to improvise a little bit, or he had to have better protection in the pocket, which worked at times in the second half, but certainly not enough, as we know. And then anytime he got any sort of pressure, ball was thrown away. Or I think it was on the one drive, he decided to try to make something with his legs on third and 10, and that's not going to work. for with someone like him. So that was certainly frustrating. And then the other one, this is a completely different point. So Ben, feel free to go however you want to go with this one after I mention this one. I think it was Eric Hansen who actually just moved to Rivals from the South Bend Tribune. Maybe it was Tyler James, but they said that Notre Dame's 3 best passing performances ever from a yardage standpoint have all come in losses. It was Joe Theismann back when he was a Notre Dame quarterback, Jack Cohn today, and Brady Quinn in 2005 have all ended up in losses. And it makes you wonder. I mean, Notre Dame certainly put up enough points today to say that they should have won the game if the defense, held, even with the offense sputtering in the second half, as we've mentioned. But the lack of no running game, I think, certainly hurt them as the game went on.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That 2005 game by Brady Quinn, on kind of a side note, that had to have been probably the Michigan State game that they lost. Because that would have been the year that was the Bush push year. But as I recall, they ran the ball actually quite a bit in the Bush push game. And the only other game I think they lost that year before the bowl game was Michigan State earlier that year. And I know that because I was at both of them. But
I'm going to try to find it while you're talking.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense, to be honest with you. I mean, if you're having to throw the ball that much, that generally means you're not running it, right? I mean, and so, gosh, I don't know. Like, to me, like one of the bigger things, and I said it a little bit, but I didn't make a huge point of it earlier, was one of the biggest things that really bugged me was that Notre Dame made such strides in the running game throughout the year. And then it's like they got to their bowl game and they're like, well, forget that. You know what I mean? It's just, I don't know. If you run the ball a little bit more effectively, I mean, I think the broadcast said, and I know this wasn't how it ended because, there was obviously plenty of game left, but at some point in the second half, Oklahoma State had run like 42 plays and Notre Dame had run 19. I mean, that's just a real bad recipe for trying to hang on and win a football game of that caliber when Oklahoma State's offense is better than it played early, when better than, pretty explosive. Sorry about the dog barking there. He like D-Rock said, obviously he's upset as well. But and excuse the cough and all of this, the longer I talk, the worse it gets, of course. But I don't know, like no compliment, no anything that, there was nothing to stop the bleeding. It's like Notre Dame threw out their whole toolbox at the beginning and then didn't have the run game. And then, like I say, this is kind of what we're saying. Like maybe Tyler Buckner could have been the guy, the tool to stop the bleeding, move the ball a couple times, at least pin him deep. And then,
and he has shown so many times that it doesn't have to just be running with him too. He's made big plays in the passing game, mostly because he's able to bring more people into the box because they think that they have to stop the running game with him.
Right, exactly. So, or it's the RPO, it's the getting it out quick to Mayer after, as he gets out on the edge, or even just picking up 4 or 5 yards and sliding. Like, I don't know. That Notre Dame had no answers. And like I say, that's the overwhelming umbrella thing that you can say about this, is that there was no, how many times have we seen the script be flipped here? Notre Dame gets down big, fights back, but then the other team figures out how to win at the end.
Yeah.
And then you finally see Notre Dame actually come out strong, actually get a lead. I can't really recall, and, I don't know if I'm wrong, just tell me that I'm wrong, but I just can't recall a time where Notre Dame got up this big and blew it that way. And lost.
There was a stat, and I forget exactly how many games it had been, but essentially since 2004, Notre Dame has not lost a game when they've scored or when they've been up 21 points.
21. So I think it was 72 games.
It was like 79 and nothing since 2004. So this idea that, Notre Dame can't win a big game is chump, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this is something that in fairness, is unprecedented even for Notre Dame standards in these types of games. And I want to preface this by saying, before we kind of move on and talk about some other stuff, I don't think me and you, like, I know people are kind of coming in and probably think we're hyping up Buckner a little bit too much. It really isn't the idea that Buckner should have been playing over Cone. It's the idea Cone played, I think, very well overall today. I mean, the stats show that. Second half, like I said, is obviously sputtered, and I don't really think it was his fault that Notre Dame lost this game. So he doesn't really deserve any sort of hatred by Notre Dame fans today. It was just the idea that there were probably times in this game that something else could have been done, whether that means maybe trying to stick to the running game just a little bit more, even with Cone in there, or or going to Buckner. That's pretty much really what it came down to. I wanted to say, hey, stick to the short passing game, but obviously the short passing game wasn't there in the second half, so that was hard to stick to. And then obviously it came down to the defense not being able to make any plays, which I think the offense and in their inability to move the football in the second half caused that, or at least part of it. And before you talk, but I did find that stat. It was Joe Theismann for 526 yards in 1970 versus USC. That's number one. Jack Cone today for 509 yards. Loss. And then Brady Quinn, like you mentioned, against Michigan State in 2005, which was also a loss. So it was I'm not saying that that's an indictment that that they should run the ball more necessarily. I mean, sometimes it's, if it's working, it's working. But it is an interesting stat.
Well, and I didn't really articulate this very well. So if I can rewind that a little bit, obviously if you're passing the ball a lot, generally that means you can't run it. But the other part is, if you're passing the ball a lot, you're either moving the ball a lot, okay, and your defense is on the field a whole awful lot, or you're not moving the ball a lot and the defense is on your field a lot. Now, obviously, if you're throwing for a lot of yards, it just means that there's a lot of shorter possessions. And so, I think for our defense today is that, you scored so quick and so often a couple of times that, like, even when you had a real positive thing on offense, it's like the defense is like, oh my God, I just sat down. Like, can I just get another breather real quick? And, when you're down Cam Hart and you're, obviously don't have Kyle Hamilton because of, reasons that I know people have been arguing about in the comments, then, you're not at full strength anyway. You don't have your full arsenal of defensive backs. And then they're on the field for 2/3 of the game, it feels like, and it's just not a recipe to win, like I say. So I keep using the phrase complimentary football. That's really what I mean. It's just that it would have been nice, even in some of those drives that went well for Notre Dame in the first half, would have been nice to maybe just mix in a couple run plays, take 2 more minutes of time off the clock, and not give Oklahoma State so many opportunities. And I really feel like that has a lot of emphasis, a lot of, I don't know what the word I'm looking for, a big impact on what really ended up happening to Notre Dame today.
Yeah. And then I want to touch on 2 things. One kind of not really about this game, and the other one more about this game and sort of future driven. Seen a lot of comments, and I knew this was going to happen. And sometimes you kind of just have to eat it as a Notre Dame fan when it comes to this stuff. That Notre Dame hasn't won a big bowl game since 1994 or whatever it is. I just find it interesting that people say that Notre Dame is fraudulent on a yearly basis when they, in general, they play a good schedule. So, like, they do beat good teams, very good teams, on a consistent basis throughout the regular season. They've hung in there with some very good teams for losses in games in the regular season. Georgia comes to mind. I think they barely lost to Georgia the year that Georgia blew it to Alabama in the national championship game. They played a very, very good game against Georgia. And I think that was actually on the road, if I'm not mistaken. So, but it all kind of jumbles together at this point. But so this idea that Notre Dame, is fraudulent, can't win big games, blah, blah, blah. It's really dumb to me. Have they lost all of the big games at the end of the season? Yes, essentially. But at the same time, most of the time they're playing someone like Alabama or LSU or Florida or Ohio State or Clemson, and I know that is, I know that, like, people want to say that that's an excuse, but most of the teams that they've run into and lost in these big games have been better. I think that's a fact. Obviously losing to Oklahoma State today, that's one you can point to where I don't think that Oklahoma State's better, but they lost. They're without their two of their best players. It's not an excuse. But at least in today's football society and in the college football world, I think it's at least a little bit of an excuse that you can make. And on the other side of the thing, Oklahoma State didn't have any opt-outs for the game, if I'm not mistaken. I think they had their starting center was hurt, and maybe a few other guys were hurt, but they didn't have any opt-outs for bowl season. And then obviously, what was it, 2002 when they lost to Oregon State, or whatever it is. So there's definitely been a few where I think you can sit there and say, okay, Notre Dame's lost. But for the most part, I think they've lost to just better teams. I'll let you kind of comment on that, and then I'll bring up the last thing I wanted to mention, which will be, I think, another good discussion here to wrap it up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I disagree. I mean, certainly.
It sounds excusey, and I get that.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the criticism, though, with Notre Dame is that not only have they lost some of these bowl games, but, they were close against Georgia twice, once at home, once obviously in Athens. I mean, they lost to, if you go all the way back, losing to Clemson in the Hurricane was kind of a big one. And then there were games after that, going down to Miami, getting the brakes beat off of them. Kind of a similar situation going up to Michigan, getting the brakes beat off of them. So, there's a little bit of truth to that statement, but at the same time, those games aren't the only marquee games on Notre Dame's schedule every year. I mean, for a lot of other teams, that is, a lot of other schools do only play one big game like that out of conference, especially per year. And so if Notre Dame was a team like that, then yeah, you would say that they always lose the big ones, but it's not true. I mean, they schedule, Stanford in 2012, the game where they win, on the goal line stand. Stanford was really good. That's a big game. I don't know. So, and you can point to a million other. Yeah, exactly. Perfect example. So, right. I think the team that people nitpick at Notre Dame because they see them lose, but Notre Dame has so many marquee games on their schedule because they don't play in a conference, I might add, that, because Notre Dame, it seems like they lose a big game or two every year. It's Notre Dame always loses in big games. Well, that's not true because they play 5 big games every year. So yeah. I don't know. That's what I would add to that.
And someone brought up how many bowl games has Notre Dame won in the last 20 years period. Looking, I don't know the exact 20-year history, but for the most part, they've won pretty much every bowl game they've been in that hasn't been a New Year's Six bowl, at least from what I can remember. They beat LSU a few times that wasn't considered a New Year's Six bowl, but they were good bowl games. They beat Iowa State a few years ago when Notre Dame, that was to get Notre Dame to 10 wins, and Iowa State was considered good that year. Again, and I don't want to use opt-outs and different things like this as an excuse. I'm not trying to do that. It kind of comes out that way to an extent. But it really comes down to this idea that Notre Dame doesn't. They've blown it in big games at the end of the season or in bowl season, whether it's New Year's Six, playoff, whatever. I think for the most part, the times that they've lost, 90% of the time they've been the worst team. Today, I don't think that that's the case. And there's been some other cases as well. But in the playoff, look what everybody else is doing in the playoff against Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, and Georgia when they play them. Those teams are losing to each other, but they're beating everybody else. and they're beating everybody else as just as much or worse than Notre Dame. So from that standpoint, I think it's just a fraudulent argument. But so yeah, if you want to say that Notre Dame has lost big bowl games, sure, I completely agree. I've watched most of them. But this idea that they don't play a good schedule and they never beat anybody good, that's when I'm going to have a little bit of an issue with the argument, and it just seems very leaky to me as an argument, if that makes any sense.
Yep.
So, and then the last thing I wanted to mention, we haven't really talked. I know we've mentioned the defense a little bit. We talked about Clarence Lewis a little bit as well. And this is sort of more big picture thinking. And again, this is way different topic than we're moving off of. So if you guys have questions or comments and stuff like that, me and Ben are here to talk to you guys for however long. But the one thing that gets me excited, and you even see it today, Peyton Bowen commits to Notre Dame, top 50, top 75 recruit in the secondary, something that Notre Dame hasn't gotten enough of over the last couple of years. I think this is the worst you're going to see out of Notre Dame secondary, which was sort of like the last hurdle that they needed to get over, at least on defense, because the defensive line has been very good over the last couple of years. Linebacker play, even this year, has been good in general. I think with Maris Leafau being out for the season and a couple other injuries, they might have had a little bit of kind of like the old days where Notre Dame had solid linebacking play, but maybe not elite athletic linebacker play, like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, for example. But Maris Leafau would have provided that for them. But in the secondary, especially without Kyle Hamilton, in today's game, you really saw Clarence Lewis get exposed. You saw the safeties, I think, get exposed. And people are excited about safety play moving forward with Xavier Watson, Ramon Henderson, and so on and so forth. But now you have two top-notch guys coming in this year with Jaden Mickey and Benjamin Morrison, who everybody's excited about. Next year, you already have 3 4-stars and 3 top 150 guys committed, and Peyton Bowen, Justin Rhett out of a school right down the street from me, actually here in Las Vegas, and Adon Schuler. So that's kind of what gets me excited, is that this is essentially the worst you're going to see this secondary over the next 3 to 4 years, and so on. And I'm really excited to see how they can kind of shore up that part of the, of the defensive side of the football for them.
Yeah, I mean, and I think a couple people are saying it even in the comments right now. Somebody a little bit ago said, let Marcus Freeman get his recruits in there and really mold that defense, to be more in his, his image, I guess you could kind of say. And I think that's exactly what's going to happen. I mean, I think that, we've seen flashes of the offense. We knew that, Notre Dame was going to have to find some receivers. And obviously the receiver room is one that I guess you could kind of say is a major point of concern to a certain degree. But, on the defensive side of the football, I think that this is where you're going to see Notre Dame rise to, the level of elite that got them to the national championship in 2012 and, got them to the college football playoff. And then if you bring the offense along anymore, because, the knock on the offense at those times was that it just wasn't good enough down the field. Well, I think you're kind of starting to see that even with Jack Cohn, who's not the best improvisational type quarterback in the world, that you're starting to see the downfield aspect of the offense and that type of stuff. So, I think as it all comes together, which I think regardless of today's results, I think you can't make any argument that it's not coming together in a way that's better for Notre Dame. Then I think that things are going to start to work out in games like today for Notre Dame. It's just that, like I say, at the end of the day, you thought today, with all the positive momentum, you thought today was going to be it. But brighter days are ahead on both sides of the football for Notre Dame, that's for sure.
Yeah, and maybe with the whole schedule argument, this year was maybe a bad example. Notre Dame still showed, I think, at the end of the year to have a top 15 strength of schedule or whatever it was. But obviously some down teams this year. Florida State's been down for the last couple of years. USC, same thing. Best team they played ended up being Cincinnati, who did make the college football playoff. So kudos to them. And that was obviously something they probably weren't expecting when they scheduled them. Wisconsin was kind of up and down at times this year. But at the same time, they do schedule hard teams on a yearly basis. Just look at next year. They have Clemson and Ohio State on the schedule. They have Texas A&M coming up. Alabama, they have a home and home with coming up as well. So it's not like Notre Dame has this refusal to play good teams. You can't, you play who's in front of you. And if they're down that year, they're down. Who knows? When Notre Dame plays Alabama in 2028, Nick Saban will probably be retired, and maybe they'll be down. And then people will talk about how Notre Dame doesn't have a good schedule. So, but moving back towards what we were just talking about in regards to recruiting, that's what really gets me excited is that Marcus Freeman is bringing it on the recruiting trail. You're already seeing it. 2023 is ranked the number one recruiting class in the country right now on 24/7 Sports, and I think on 3 as well. I haven't checked out Rivals recruiting, and it's not just like, oh, it's early. I mean, they have everybody committed right now is a 4-star or better. Keon Keeley is a 5-star defensive end out of Florida who everybody wants. Drake Bowen, Peyton Bowen are both top-notch 4-star guys. At linebacker and secondary, and in the secondary. Like I already mentioned, Justin Rhett at corner. I think he's the best corner recruit that they've landed, at least rankings wise, since Gary Gray of the Charlie Weiss years. So I mean, things are trending up, and it's not just like, I know every year Notre Dame has a pretty good class, and sometimes they are ranked number 1 or number 2 to start out, but this year is a little bit, or at least the 2023 class, I should say, is a little bit more legit. I was playing around and for those of you who are big recruiting people, you'll find this fun. I was playing around on the 24/7 Sports like class rankings thing where you can kind of create your own class. If Notre Dame were to land, and this is before they landed Bowen, so I think right now they have 8 commits. If they were to land 6 more realistic commits, they will have the same rating that they have this year with 21 guys. And this year is one of their best classes of the Brian Kelly era, I should say. So that just goes to show you what the 2023 class could be and where everything's kind of trending right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's exciting. Like, we've talked, so many times on this podcast, other podcasts that we've done together about, and really, actually, I guess it's not just us either. There are people who have broadcasted Notre Dame games in the college football playoffs have said, Notre Dame is just a step behind in this area and that area. And it all boils down to the talent and the recruiting. And now we're starting to see that's, where we thought we had hit a ceiling. Well, apparently we hadn't hit a ceiling. And that's the part, I guess, that makes being a Notre Dame fan right now, pretty exciting. Like I say, today stings. I mean, I keep going back to that because obviously that's still pretty fresh. I mean, game ended a little over an hour ago now, and obviously it's going to sting because you just sort of felt like you wanted that storybook thing with Marcus Freeman and all of that. But like I said earlier, the story with Marcus Freeman probably it's not really fair to start it today. The story with Brian Kelly ends today. The story with Marcus Freeman is starting now, and I'm excited for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was kind of the point I think both of us were making earlier, probably before a lot of the people were that are still listening or that are listening now even heard. But it really did feel sort of like the end of the Brian Kelly era today. It's Marcus Freeman's first game as a head coach, but you can essentially throw an interim title on him today, just because I think with the continuity things, he was probably still sort of more like the defensive coordinator to an extent, sort of like playing acting head coach in a bowl game. And, it's hard. I mean, I know it technically I think will go down as 0-1 for him as a head coach because he was announced the head coach and it's not an interim title and so on and so forth. But yeah, it's I think it really does start now. This is where the Freeman era starts, and you'll see that on the recruiting trail, and we'll see it hopefully next year in some big games. And that's where I think we can start kind of separating Brian Kelly and Freeman to see who is, maybe the better coach. Maybe they're somewhat equal. Maybe it's going to take a few years for Freeman. I mean, obviously as a first-year head coach, there's going to be some bumps and bruises, I suppose. But we'll see if he can win against Clemson and Ohio State when they're at full strength. If they get into the playoff next year or get into a New Year's Six bowl and they win, that's really where I think his legacy will kind of start. Not in today's game.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I don't really have anything else to add.
Marine 76 things is saying he hopes it's interim. I can tell you right now it's not. Maybe he gets fired in 3 years, maybe he doesn't, but it's definitely not an interim title. I know it's probably a joke more than anything because maybe he's not the biggest Marcus Freeman fan, but it's definitely not an interim title, at least as of right now.
Right.
Ben, you got anything kind of else to sort of wrap this up?
I don't think so. Oh, sorry.
No, I was saying not a lot of coming in. So
Right. Yeah, no, not really. The voice is starting to go, to be honest with you. So I did as well as I could there for a while, but it's starting to leave. That's being a basketball coach right in the middle of like flu and upper respiratory season.
fair enough. We'll actually end it with a few questions. A few come Marine 76 here again. All right, legit question. When it goes to 12-team playoff, does independence still make sense to Notre Dame? I think they've answered that question, whether people want to agree with it or not. They have essentially said that they are willing to give up being a top 4 seed to get a home Notre Dame game. In December where it could be snowing and teams aren't probably going to want to be there because they haven't had a home December game in forever, essentially. So I don't think it really affect them. I think they like the idea of getting essentially a free home game. If they were to be the 5-6 seed or whatever it is. I don't exactly know what that 12-team format's going to look like or if it's actually going to end up being legit. I don't think it's officially been approved yet, but yeah, no, I mean, Notre Dame has at least answered the question that I think that they are okay with staying independent with the 12-team and not going into an automatic bye or whatever it is that will come with it.
Yeah, and I think it gets people off their back a little bit too. I mean, since they're not in a conference, I mean, this is their essentially like their conference championship equivalent. You can't get one of the top 4 seeds if that's how it goes. So people can't whine and moan about that. And Notre Dame gets that opportunity to play that 13th game and then just kind of be on the same footing as some of those other teams. So who would get the automatic bid, if things hold the way that they were reported to work out when it became, I don't know, news that the college football playoff is looking at 12 teams.
Yeah. And Marine also mentioned, I don't know if it's a conference championship that gets the top 4. I'm not sure how it's going to work out. I don't think everything's been discussed yet, but when like kind of the early things came back, Notre Dame essentially accepted the fact that, hey, we will, as our punishment or whatever for not playing a 13th game or with that 13th data point, they've essentially said we're okay with being the 5 seed if we get left out in that way. So I think if it does end up being a 12 thing or like a 12 team format, that will be the case, especially because Notre Dame's kind of agreed to that fact and Swarbrick said he's okay with it and so on and so forth. But we'll see how it goes and kind of go from there. Now, with that said, I wouldn't say that Notre Dame should do that. I think if the committee thinks you're the second best team in the country, they should be okay with being the second best team in the country and just taking that. And then I don't know. I think it will be the 12 team format will be fun anyway. I think it's actually gonna maybe speak to the idea that there's a little bit more parity in college football than we realize. I do think that the committee's gotten it correct most years, if not all years, with the top 4 based off resume and results. Because I do think that's important. For example, do I think Notre Dame's a better football team than Cincinnati? I do. I don't think Notre Dame deserved to be in the college football playoff over Cincinnati this year based on on-field results and resume. Cincinnati beat Notre Dame straight up at Notre Dame, and they went on to win the rest of their games. So it was hard for me to sit there on, the day that everybody or the committee bull pick day and say Notre Dame deserved to be in. So, but what I think it will do is there's going to be teams in the SEC. There's going to be like this year with Ohio State losing to Michigan and not getting a chance in the playoff. Maybe Ohio State's not that good this year. They're losing to Utah in the Rose Bowl, and they've lost some questionable games this year in general. But you might see some of those like, okay, a team has a hiccup and they're able to still play in this 12-team format, and maybe they go far. I think Alabama would have been a good example of that this year if they would have lost to Georgia in the SEC championship. I think Alabama is probably a top 4 talent this year. But if they would have lost that Georgia game, they probably would have been like the 8 or 9 seed or whatever it may be. And then they probably end up making the national championship or the semis or whatever. And again, that's Alabama, so maybe it's a bad example, but I think that there's other teams out there on a yearly basis that are probably better than the top 4 on, talent wise and stuff like that, and can certainly get to those points. And so yeah, I think it's actually going to show a little bit more parity with the 12-team format versus the 4-team format, because you really have to base it off results and resume in the 4-team format.
Right. And this isn't a correction, more of an addition. I mean, you kind of alluded to it. Or a team like Notre Dame this year that was playing like terrible at the beginning of the year and then gets kind of hot, down the stretch. I mean, those are the types of teams you want to see in the playoff. Now, maybe after today's game, that's maybe not the best example, but you get my point. I mean, Notre Dame was playing as well as anybody that last week of the season. So, a 12-team format obviously would have gotten Notre Dame, even a 16 format would have got Notre Dame into that situation. So I think it's going to be good for college football in general.
And the other thing with that too is you're going to get less opt-outs, which is what everybody wants. You're going to get teams at essentially their full strength. Again, it's not an excuse in bowl season. Some teams, some players continue to play, some don't. In today's case with Notre Dame, they're up 28-7. So I don't think Kyle Hamilton and Kyron Williams not being there should be any sort of excuse for them losing that game. They simply got dominated in the second half, and Oklahoma State won. But you put Kyron Williams and Kyle Hamilton on the field in a playoff format, Notre Dame's an insanely better team than just what they showed today. I mean, that's two out of their 3 best players. And that goes for everybody. I mean, you look at even someone like, I think it was Pitt, Kenny Pickett was out for Pitt, and they lost to Michigan State by 10 points. Pitt might be better than Michigan State this year if Kenny Pickett's playing. And there's a lot of other examples that you can point to. So when you have this 12-team format or 8-team format, whatever it is, you're going to get more games with everybody playing at full strength, and then you're going to get a better idea in bowl season who's actually good, who's maybe fraudulent, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, can't argue with that.
But all right, we've been rambling on for a little over an hour now, and obviously this was the last one of the year, so it was good to kind of just talk, especially with everything that happened in today's Notre Dame game. I'm sure, like I said, maybe this wasn't the best time for myself and Ben to get on. I know he's kind of feeling sick, and sometimes it's hard to put things together right after the game with with emotions running high and so on and so forth. I know for me, I find it hard to articulate my thoughts when I'm in front of a screen without rewatching the game and so on and so forth. But thanks for tuning in, guys, this entire year. I know some of you are listening here on the Voice of College Football, like the main channel. We also have our Notre Dame channel, and I think me and Ben have some fun things ahead for you guys here in the off season as well. And then also, we're hopefully going to be back here next year with you guys for the Notre Dame post-game show at the Voice of College Football. So some good things ahead. Enjoy the off season. Enjoy the new year, guys. Hopefully 2022 is better than 2021, even if you had a good 2021. So we'll catch you next year.